Before we begin, take a breath. This isn't just a podcast. It's a new way to think, speak, and live in English. Welcome to Confluent Podcast, where words flow, confidence grows, and every sip brings you closer to fluency.
I love that intro.
Yeah, it really sets the tone, right?
Yeah.
And I want to jump straight into the heart of the matter today because we've got this massive stack of notes, and it basically completely upends a system that most of us have been trapped in since childhood.
Oh, absolutely. It's wild to read through.
Right. Like we are pulling from the insights of a very prominent, highly successful language coach today, someone who has literally spent decades just dismantling the traditional educational apparatus.
Yeah, dismantling is definitely the right word for it.
So our mission for this deep dive is to, map out this century-old mathematical formula for fluency. We're going to expose the physiological reasons why traditional classrooms actually paralyze your brain.
Which is a huge claim, but the science completely backs it up.
Exactly. And finally, we're going to prove, biologically, why your age is actually your greatest asset when you're learning. Whether you're studying for a big job interview or prepping for a move abroad, or, you just want to improve yourself, this is going to reshape how you approach learning entirely.
Right. So to really frame this whole discussion, we kind of have to isolate the core philosophy driving this coach's methodology.
Okay. Lay on me.
The premise is basically this massive paradigm shift away from the industrial model of education. The main assertion is that language acquisition is, it's 80% psychology and attitude.
80%.
Yeah, and only 20% mechanics and methods. But, the vast majority of institutional learning, like schools, they focus obsessively on that 20%.
Yeah, the syntax, the grammar drills, the endless vocabulary lists.
Exactly. And they just ignore the psychological foundation entirely.
That 80-20 split feels like the key to everything. Because if we look at the sheer volume of hours a typical student spends in, say, a middle school language class, agonizing over verb conjugations.
It's agonizing for everyone involved.
Right. Just pure mechanics. It becomes so obvious why the failure rate is astronomically high. The system is hyper-focusing on the absolute smallest variable of success.
Yeah, it's totally backwards.
But where does this formalized framework even come from? Because the notes mention an origin point that predates modern educational psychology by a lot.
Yeah, so we actually have to travel back roughly 100 years.
100 years.
Yeah, to the work of a female Hungarian polyglot. And you have to remember, she was operating in an era completely devoid of the digital tools we take for granted today.
Oh, right. No smartphone apps, no instant translation.
No global internet access to native audio, nothing. Just pure analog learning. But through her own trial, error, and eventual mastery of multiple languages, she codified her process.
And she turned it into a math formula, right?
Exactly. It's a shockingly simple mathematical formula. It goes like this: motivation multiplied by time divided by stress equals success or fluency.
Okay, wait. Let me make sure I've got that. Motivation times time divided by stress.
That's the one.
So let's break down the top half of that equation first. Specifically, the easiest, most tangible variable you can isolate, which is time.
Right. Time is the foundation.
Because the coach's notes insist that you, as a learner, should really only track the number of hours you spend listening and reading, and absolutely nothing else.
Nothing else. You have to completely abandon tracking test scores.
Which is so hard for people to do.
It's incredibly hard, but you have to drop the obsession with CEFR levels like am I an A1 or a B2 and throw out the flashcard word counts entirely.
So why is tracking time so effective compared to all those other metrics?
Well, it requires a fundamental rewiring of the brain's reward system. See, modern learners are completely conditioned to measure outputs.
With taking a quiz.
Exactly. A test score is an output. A memorized vocabulary list is an output. The problem is, measuring outputs in language acquisition is, the brain's ability to recall a specific word on command is highly volatile.
It depends on so much, right? Like how well you slept.
Yes, it's deeply affected by mood, fatigue, context. So when you fail to produce the output, like you forget the word or bomb the practice test, your brain literally releases cortisol.
Oh, the stress hormone.
Right.
Right.
You experience failure, and that directly damages your psychological foundation. But if you shift the metric entirely to inputs, like just tracking the hours you spent listening to a podcast, you guarantee a win.
Because you did the time.
Exactly. Doing an hour of listening is an objective success, regardless of how much you perfectly memorized. You simply log the hour.
You know, I look at it through the lens of fitness tracking.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
It's the profound difference between tracking how many calories you burned on a treadmill versus simply tracking the fact that you walked in the park for an hour.
Right, the treadmill makes you stare at the screen.
Exactly. The screen forces you to obsess over the machine's arbitrary numbers. And if the calorie count feels too low for the effort you put in, you just feel defeated.
It turns a walk into a chore.
It totally turns a natural human movement into a clinical, depressing chore. But if your only goal is, hey, I just need to walk in the woods for 60 minutes today, you successfully build a healthy habit.
Because you separate the action from the anxiety of the immediate result.
Yeah, but playing devil's advocate here, without tests, how do you actually know you're moving forward?
Well, the neurochemistry actually supports that analogy perfectly. By measuring time spent, you are building consistent dopamine loops. Every time you log an hour, you trigger a small reward response in the brain.
So the habit reinforces itself.
Exactly. And the coach applies this ruthlessly to his own continuing education. He's actually currently learning Japanese and Spanish.
Oh, wow. Both at once.
Yeah, and his sole structural framework relies on specific time-based goals.
Like what? What does that look like?
So a short-term goal for him might look like reaching, say, 600 hours of pure auditory and visual input by November. And then the long-term goal is 1,000 hours by March.
Setting a goal of 1,000 hours, that shifts the entire emotional weight of the undertaking.
It really does.
If my objective is to pass a proficiency exam by November, every single study session is haunted by this one persistent question, which is, am I good enough yet?
And that question just breeds hesitation.
It does. But if the goal is strictly logging hours, the daily task is simply to show up and consume the content. You bypass the self-evaluation entirely.
Right, you just put the time in.
But, and here's the catch, sitting with a foreign language for 1,000 hours brings us to the multiplier in our formula.
Yes. Motivation.
Because sitting with incomprehensible noise for 1,000 hours is just a fast track to cognitive burnout.
Yeah.
If you're miserable, it's impossible.
That's exactly right. Time is merely the vessel. Motivation determines the quality of the journey within that vessel.
So high motivation makes the time fly by.
High motivation functions as a force multiplier. It makes the passage of time feel effortless. But low motivation, that turns those same hours into an agonizing, friction-filled grind.
So how do we keep the multiplier high?
Well, the methodology demands a complete rejection of sterile academic texts. You have to fill those hours with compelling narratives.
Like what kind of narratives?
Mini stories, novels, long-form podcasts, even translated graphic novels or manga. You want enjoyable, low-stress content instead of boring grammar textbooks.
Which introduces this massive paradox that I see constantly in adult learners. Let's call it the efficiency trap.
Oh, the efficiency trap is so real.
Because we are culturally conditioned to optimize everything, right? So a learner will download this sophisticated flashcard algorithm because it promises to feed them the exact vocabulary they need at the exact mathematical interval for optimal memory retention.
Right, spaced repetition.
Yeah, they look at the data and say, okay, 2 hours of this algorithm is the most mathematically efficient way to learn.
But the flaw in that logic is that it isolates the variable of efficiency while totally ignoring the variable of human endurance.
It ignores the fact that we aren't robots.
Exactly. Let's analyze the math of the efficiency trap. A rote memorization algorithm might offer 100% efficiency in vocabulary encoding for the duration of that session.
Sure, on paper.
But because the process is devoid of narrative, devoid of emotion, and cognitively exhausting, your motivation just plummets.
You sustain that routine for, 14 days? And then you burn out and abandon the language entirely.
Exactly. And on the other side of the paradox, you have someone reading a mystery novel or a comic book in their target language.
Where the vocabulary isn't perfectly optimized.
Right. They might encounter words they won't need in daily life, or they might miss the perfectly timed repetition. On paper, it looks perhaps 40% as efficient as the algorithm.
But the difference is they actually want to do it.
Right. The 40% efficiency of the novel is sustainable for 5 years because the learner is genuinely invested in finding out who committed the murder in the story.
Oh, that's such a good point.
40% efficiency sustained over 5 years will always yield a level of fluency that a 14-day optimized algorithm could never touch. The inefficient narrative method is, in reality, the only mathematically sound strategy for long-term retention.
We really have to look at the cognitive architecture behind why stories stick and why isolated facts just evaporate.
Yeah, let's unpack that.
Because my understanding of the brain's filing system is that it thrives on context. Trying to memorize a list of 20 disconnected verbs from a textbook, it feels akin to memorizing a random string of numbers.
There are no hooks for the brain to grab onto. Schools teach disconnected facts, and it honestly just confuses children.
You were describing the difference between semantic memory and episodic memory, aren't you?
I am. Semantic memory stores abstract facts and concepts, while episodic memory stores events, narratives, and experiences. The human brain evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to transmit and retain survival information through storytelling around a fire.
Long before written language even existed.
Exactly. So when the sources emphasize using, say, Louis L'Amour westerns or compelling historical fiction, they are actively leveraging that episodic memory.
The brain encodes the new vocabulary effortlessly because it is glued to the emotional tension of the story.
Right, like the cowboy reaching for his hat before the duel. The emotion is the binding agent.
So we use narrative to hack the motivation multiplier, but the notes highlight an even more potent driver of motivation than just finding a good story.
Oh, the need factor.
Yes, the transition from a want to a need. It's the realization that motivation isn't just something you manufacture internally. Sometimes it's something the environment violently forces upon you.
And the psychology of need overrides almost all internal resistance. The language coach actually provides a really transparent look at his own early struggles with Japanese.
He struggled with it.
Oh, yeah. He initially possessed just a mild, lingering desire to learn the language. He took trips to Japan, engaged in casual study, but the motivation continually evaporated whenever the process became difficult.
The desire was purely theoretical.
Exactly. It remained in the realm of a hobby.
It's the classic, I would love to learn French someday mentality. Millions of people carry that around for decades without ever opening a book.
But the shift for him occurred due to a massive structural life change. The coach and his wife had 2 babies and subsequently made the decision to relocate to Japan permanently.
Oh, wow, that's a huge shift.
The environment instantly transformed.
Yeah.
He was suddenly surrounded by extended family, nieces, nephews, and the daily logistical demands of navigating a foreign society as a full-time parent.
So the luxury of the want just vanished.
Goof. Gone. Replaced by the immediate practical need to understand the world his children were living in. Suddenly, his motivation skyrocketed from 0 to massive.
The external requirement completely obliterated his internal procrastination. He didn't have to search for motivation anymore. The motivation woke him up every single morning.
Exactly.
But for you, the listener tuning in right now, you likely aren't packing your bags to move across the globe next week.
Probably not.
You have to engineer that momentum in your daily life. Which brings up a remarkably practical, tactical piece of advice from the sources regarding how to remove friction from daily reading.
Yeah, managing the friction of the input is absolutely paramount to protecting that motivation multiplier. If the act of consuming the story becomes more arduous than the story is enjoyable, the habit just collapses.
The coach details his experience trying to read physical caper manga in Japanese. And, there's a deep tactile romance to holding a physical book.
Yeah, I love physical books.
Same. But the reality of doing it in a language you haven't mastered is brutal.
It really is.
You encounter an unknown word. You have to physically put the book down, pull out your phone or a heavy dictionary, type the characters in, find the definition, try to remember it, and then pick the book back up and try to reimmerse yourself in the scene.
You are constantly severing the episodic memory loop. Every interruption is a micro-tax on your cognitive load.
Which is why the sources advocate heavily for the transition to digital formats, ebooks, and specialized reading apps.
Because the mechanical advantage is that the friction of translation is reduced to a single tap.
Right. You tap the unknown word, the definition appears instantly, and the narrative flow remains unbroken.
It seems like a minor technological convenience, right? But on a neurochemical level, it completely prevents the frustration spike that often leads a learner to abandon the session.
It detects the numerator. We have massive amounts of time multiplied by a high frictionless motivation.
Exactly.
But now we have to confront the denominator of our century-old formula, the element that fractures, divides, and fundamentally destroys all that hard work.
Stress, the silent killer.
Stress. Within the realm of applied linguistics, particularly in the extensive research of Dr. Stephen Krashen, this barrier is clinically termed the affective filter.
Right, the affective filter. We use the colloquial term stress, but the affective filter is a highly specific biological and psychological blockade. When a learner experiences anxiety, fear of judgment, or performance pressure, the affective filter rises.
Let's get into the biological mechanics of that blockade. because people often treat stress as an abstract feeling rather than a physical rerouting of the brain's resources.
Mm.
What is actually happening inside the skull when the effective filter spikes?
It is essentially an amygdala hijack.
An amygdala hijack.
Okay. When the brain perceives a threat, even a social threat, like making a fool of oneself in front of peers, the amygdala triggers the release of stress hormones, primarily cortisol and adrenaline.
Because it thinks you're in physical danger.
Exactly. The biological imperative is survival, not language processing. Consequently, blood flow and electrical activity are literally routed away from the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for complex thought, working memory, and language retrieval.
Oh, wow. So it physically starves the language center.
Yes. It redirects all that energy toward the more primitive regions controlling the fight, flight, or freeze response. The language center of the brain is chemically and electrically starved. And even in your native language, immense stress, like a high-stakes job interview or speaking in front of 500 people, makes you forget words, stutter, and lose your train of thought.
That is so true. I've forgotten my own name on stage before.
Right. So if stress destroys your native fluency, of course it will completely paralyze your second language fluency.
If we overlay that biological reality onto the blueprint of a traditional middle school language class, it paints a horrifying picture.
It really does.
We have basically designed an environment perfectly calibrated to trigger the fight, flight, or freeze response. The constant testing, the forced public reading, the surprise pop quizzes.
The forced memorization of grammar rules.
Yes. And the looming fear of making mistakes that could impact your entire academic future. Traditional schools are the ultimate stress factories.
They are. The guiding philosophy derived from the sources is that forcing an unwilling, stressed student to acquire a language is a biological impossibility. The mandate must be, choose your teachers, choose your students.
Learning only occurs when the effective filter is lowered through consent and psychological safety.
What exactly?
Okay, but I can hear the objections forming in the minds of our listeners right now. It's a compelling biological argument, but life is stressful.
For sure.
Some listeners have to pass a high-stakes job interview in English, or they're facing a TOEFL exam where their proficiency will dictate their ability to get a visa. We can't just hide from the world in a low-stress bubble.
That is a critical distinction, and the philosophy does not advocate for retreating from the world. It advocates for strategic inoculation.
Inoculation, like a vaccine.
Exactly. The source material presents a highly fascinating, kind of counterintuitive solution for handling inevitable performance anxiety. You cannot eliminate the high-stakes environment, so you must aggressively manipulate your own physiological response to it prior to the event.
So if inoculation implies exposing yourself to a small, manageable amount of the virus to build immunity, how do you expose yourself to the virus of a high-stakes job interview while standing in your own living room?
You bypass the psychological trigger and go straight to the physiological symptoms. To prepare for public speaking, the recommendation is to engage in intense, explosive cardiovascular exercise immediately before practicing your presentation.
Wait, like working out?
Yes, jump up and down, do burpees, sprint in place for 2 minutes. You deliberately get your heart beating fast and your breathing heavy, mimicking the exact physiological symptoms of anxiety. And then you practice your speech.
That is absolutely fascinating. You are forcing the body to sound the alarm bells, and then you force the prefrontal cortex to access the language while the alarms are blaring.
Precisely. You are decoupling the physiological arousal from the cognitive freeze. By practicing your speech while breathless and tachycardic, you train the brain to maintain access to its language centers even when the body is in a state of high alert.
So when the actual job interview happens,
And your nervous system inevitably spikes, the brain recognizes the physical state and realizes it is still perfectly capable of operating within it. The freeze response is neutralized.
the notes actually include a wonderfully simple, light linguistic reframing of this entire concept to keep things conversational. It's the observation that the word stress, spelled backwards, is desserts.
Yes.
It feels a bit like a bumper sticker, but it captures the essence of taking this paralyzing negative force and flipping it into an energizing positive input. Use the adrenaline to heighten your focus rather than letting it shut you down.
It is a vital cognitive reframe. However, managing our internal physiological response is only half the battle, because the sources allocate significant attention to the external sources of stress.
Right, the toxic learning environments.
Specifically, the devastating impact of toxic environments and the people within them.
Yeah, the notes recount this really sad story of a learner named Cher. She was attempting to study Vietnamese in a formal classroom setting. And every time Cher attempted to pronounce a new word or, just participate in the dialogue, The surrounding classmates would openly laugh and mock her inevitable mistake.
It is the absolute worst-case scenario for the effective filter.
This is terrible.
And the advice delivered to Cher by the coach was ruthless but totally necessary, he said. Quit the class. Leave.
Just walk out.
Abandon the class, walk out the door, and do not return. Self-study at home is vastly superior to staying in a toxic environment that actively kills your motivation.
The prevailing wisdom often tells students to just develop a thicker skin or ignore the bullies, but the framework we are discussing rejects that entirely. Attempting to force acquisition in an environment that induces shame is a futile waste of time.
The emotional tax is simply too high. But the story of Cher reveals a strange phenomenon that we really need to unpack, because the students laughing at Cher were not native Vietnamese speakers.
Right, they were fellow learners.
This introduces a critical behavioral pattern the coach identifies as the non-native critic. It is one of the most paradoxical elements of language learning.
Because the universal fear among beginners is that native speakers will be the harshest judges,
Right.
mentally circling your grammatical errors with a red pen.
Exactly. But the reality of interacting with native speakers on the street is shockingly forgiving. If you approach someone in Tokyo and ask for directions to the train station using broken syntax and the totally wrong verb tense, they do not care at all.
They just point to the train station.
Right. Their brain immediately filters past the grammatical errors to extract the core meaning of your request. Their objective is communication, not evaluation.
The non-native critic, however, operates from a completely different psychological baseline. When a fellow learner or even an insecure classroom teacher hyperfixates on your minor mistakes, it is rarely an act of pedagogy. It is an act of projection.
Often, they are the harshest critics because of their own fragile egos. It speaks to the sunk cost fallacy embedded in traditional learning.
Oh, that makes so much sense. Imagine a non-native critic who has spent 10 agonizing years memorizing conjugation tables and phonetic charts. If they see you attempting to bypass that suffering by naturally acquiring the language through stories, your very existence threatens their entire investment.
They feel like they must correct your grammar to validate the years of misery they endured. And the psychology goes even deeper. By identifying and highlighting your error, they artificially elevate their own status in the hierarchy.
It's just a defense mechanism.
They laugh to reassure themselves of their own competence. Recognizing this dynamic is incredibly liberating for the learner because it recontextualizes the mockery. The criticism is not a reflection of your linguistic inadequacy. It is a broadcast of their psychological insecurity.
That reframing completely disarms the critic. If their laughter is just a symptom of their own anxiety, it loses its power to raise your effective filter, which leads to a very strict rule regarding feedback and correction in real time. According to the framework, should a learner ever explicitly ask a native speaker to correct their mistakes while they are talking?
The mandate is absolute. Never ask for mid-sentence correction. It violates the core tenet of the 80-20 rule.
Never.
Never. The moment you instruct your conversation partner to flag your errors, you immediately introduce performance anxiety. It ceases to be an organic exchange of ideas and instantly transforms into a high-stakes, real-time oral examination.
You are manually turning on the X-ray machine and inviting them to look for broken bones. If I am trying to recount a funny story about my weekend and my partner interrupts me every 10 minutes to correct a preposition, the narrative thread is obliterated.
The joy of human connection is replaced by the sterile mechanics of syntax. If you are corrected constantly, your motivation will plummet to zero and you'll simply stop wanting to speak. Focus purely on communication.
Speaking of the mechanics, I want to pivot to phonetics, because this is where many learners hit a massive wall. The traditional academic approach heavily utilizes the International Phonetic Alphabet.
Oh, the IPA.
Yeah, those bizarre upside-down symbols and squiggly lines printed next to words in the dictionary. How do we physically learn to produce the correct sounds?
Well, the sources note that the phonetic alphabet is incredibly boring and stressful. Analyzing visual symbols to determine how a physical muscle in your throat should move adds an unnecessary abstract layer of cognitive processing.
So how should we do it?
Pronunciation should be learned through the ears, by listening, not through the eyes.
I found a fascinating technique in the notes addressing exactly this. It's a method popularized by the linguist Alexander Argelis called shadowing.
Shadowing is fantastic.
But my initial instinct when listening to foreign audio is always to hunt down the transcript, so I can read along while I listen. I want my eyes to confirm what my ears are hearing. But the shadowing technique strictly forbids this.
Right. Shadowing requires the learner to listen to native audio and immediately vocalize what they hear, operating almost as a simultaneous echo. And the sources suggest doing it audio only, without text, to force deeper concentration.
Because reading along provides a massive visual crutch. If I see the word written down, I stop actively listening to the subtle nuances of the speaker's breath, their intonation, and the micropauses. I just superimpose my own flawed native language pronunciation rules onto the visual text.
And English perfectly illustrates the danger of the visual crutch. English spelling is notoriously chaotic. If you rely on your eyes to decode the spelling of night or thorough, your vocal output will be wildly incorrect.
Exactly. By removing the text during shadowing, you force your brain into a state of acute auditory concentration. You must trust the raw acoustic data entering your ears over the conditioned rules stored in your visual processing centers.
It directly trains the neuromotor pathways connecting the auditory cortex to the vocal cords.
So we have dismantled the external roadblocks. We know how to navigate the efficiency trap. We understand the biology of the effective filter. We know to flee toxic classrooms. And we have stripped away the visual crutches. But the most insidious stressors are internal.
The self-limiting beliefs.
Yes, the belief that you're simply too old to learn. I hear this struggle all the time. Is my 30s, 40s, or 50s too late to start?
The cultural narrative surrounding age and language learning is incredibly fatalistic. But the sources we are exploring systematically and completely reject this. Well, the coach himself is 51 and actively learning Japanese. And his colleague, Steve Kaufman, provides an even more extreme data point. At the age of 74, Kaufman is engaged in the simultaneous acquisition of Arabic, Turkish, and Persian.
74. That is unbelievable.
The phrase, use it or lose it, applies perfectly to the brain. The myth of age dictates that brains just fail because they hit a certain number, but they actually fail because people get lazy.
The physical body analogy from the text is the perfect lens for understanding this. You can find a 35-year-old who is chronically fatigued, physically weak, and out of shape simply because they stopped moving at 18.
Right, they sat behind a desk for 2 decades.
Exactly. And conversely, you can find a 70-year-old who is strong, fit, and runs marathons because they exercise daily. The brain is a muscle. Age is just an excuse for mental laziness.
If you spend 15 years doing nothing but watching TV and not challenging your mind, of course your brain slows down. But engaging in learning a new language acts as a profound cognitive intervention. It physically stimulates the brain to make new cells and keeps it incredibly sharp.
Blaming age is an incredibly convenient shield. It requires vulnerability to be a beginner at age 50. The too old excuse protects the ego from that discomfort. Which brings us to the perennial question that exposes this desire for a shortcut. Can an adult learner master a language in 3 months?
Master it. No. The internet is saturated with promises of 90-day fluency, but you won't master it.
But can you learn it?
The coach clarifies this timeline based on his own experience prepping for a trip to Spain. With intensive daily input, an adult can definitely achieve basic effective communication in 3 months.
So the adult learner actually has a massive cognitive advantage, provided they can suppress the effective filter.
Exactly. An adult doesn't need to learn the concept of a mortgage or a train schedule. They only need to acquire the new acoustic labels for concepts they already deeply understand. A child has to learn the language and the concept simultaneously.
That is such an empowering realization. But this leads us to the final hurdle. We have established that the traditional institutional model is fundamentally broken. We have isolated the learner, advising them to retreat from toxic classrooms and engage in self-study at home.
Which brings up the isolation problem.
Yes, human beings are inherently social creatures. If the future of learning is just millions of people sitting alone in their living rooms, how do we prevent ourselves from feeling totally isolated?
The sources address this by exploring the evolution of decentralized learning communities. The notes actually highlight a recent face-to-face meeting between 2 major language experts, Steve Kaufman of LingQ and the language coach.
Discussing the future of language learning.
Exactly. They were strategizing the architectural future of language acquisition, and they are conceptualizing an entirely online language learning conference.
Oh, that's brilliant. That represents the death of the geographic gatekeeper. Because historically, accessing a community of hyper-motivated polyglots required an immense expenditure of capital.
Right, you had to purchase international flights to faraway places like Japan for polyglot conferences. You had to pay for hotels, exorbitant entry fees. It systematically excluded most people.
But by virtualizing the summit, they bypass the massive travel costs.
And it represents a huge shift in education. By curating a virtual seminar of like-minded natural learning advocates teachers, using mini stories for Polish, Spanish, French, German learners get the community aspect of schooling without the toxicity and stress.
You get to plug into a global ecosystem. It replaces the toxic accountability of the traditional classroom with the positive accountability of a shared passion. It reinforces the core value that the listener has the power to be the master of their own learning.
It really does. It finalizes the transfer of power back to the individual.
I want to synthesize the magnitude of what we have explored today, because the path to fluency is not found in the sterile perfection of a grammar textbook. The path is about maximizing motivation by finding content you genuinely love.
Exactly.
It's about logging the hours and ditching the tests and the CEFR levels, and ruthlessly eliminating stress by quitting toxic classes, ignoring insecure non-native critics, and just letting go of the fear of making mistakes.
Age is a superpower, provided you keep the brain active.
Before we wrap up, I want to pivot this entire philosophy back to our listener.
Yeah, I want to leave you with a final reflection to mull over. We've seen how stress, this effective filter, destroys our ability to naturally learn a language. But think about the rest of your life.
Where else is this happening?
Right. Where else are you unnecessarily testing yourself in your hobbies, your career, or your relationships, where you should just be playing? What would happen if you removed the effective filter from your entire life?
That is a profound question to walk away with. Thank you for joining us on this Fluent Podcast Deep Dive. Take a breath, let the words flow, and enjoy your path to fluency.